Dear audience, welcome to this third edition and last also of a three-part lecture series at SPUI 25, running this year, entitled Decolonising La Mer Mortelle. So, decolonizing the deadly sea, the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean Sea received this nickname more than 15 years ago, and it has since then only become further it has since then only further become the center, but surely not the only location of what are now the deadliest borders in the world, which are those of the EU. More than 40,000 people have lost their lives during unsafe migration journeys since 2014 on the European borders. Our colleague Thomas Spijkerboer at VU and his research team coined the word border deaths in this context. In the words of the International Organization for Migration, I quote, "These data bear witness to one of the great political failures of modern times." End quote. IOM and others involved acknowledge the difficulty of counting the bodies and admit that official numbers are probably far too low. Apart from the people that have died, and that die every day still, there are many people who live in uncertain and simply bad circumstances for years of their lives, either in asylum centers or in camps, or as illegals that are easily exploitable and always at risk of being deported, relatively invisible for European majorities, while enabling many of the goods and services they, and I should surely say we, and include myself, consume. And finally, there are many people with non-European passports living and working in the EU, who are, for example, our colleagues here at the university, who are faced with burdens of needing to take care of visa, filling in forms and legal documents, risking not to be able to go to conferences they need to attend, having to plan their careers with their passports in mind, to an extent that Europeans never have to. This deep inequality has only risen with the protests against the killings in Gaza on campuses across Europe, as well as in the Netherlands, which are regularly led and run by young scholars on precarious contracts and students of color. On top of the real insecurities they are dealing with, they are regularly also being talked about and addressed, hardly as persons with whole lives, but rather as objects of do we need them, should they go, etc., and whose social safety seems to matter just a little bit less than that of those with European citizenship. The lecture series addresses the question of whether taking a perspective that centers colonial legacies and the fundamental critiques that have been made of them in various and rich decolonial literatures can help to rethink these fundamental problems in today's migration and refugee context, and especially in connection to the Mediterranean as a border zone with long colonial and imperial legacies. Such decolonial perspectives could concern issues that have directly to do with policy, but also, and perhaps especially, rethinking what refugeehood and migration fundamentally mean, or to speak with Ngugi wa Thiong'o, what it could mean to decolonize the mind in relation to migration and refugeehood, and perhaps especially the public mind of European majorities. And we can all understand that this need has only become much greater in the last year, as it was already very great when we planned these lectures. Critical voices increasingly argue that the situation at the European borders could only be possible due to the survival of coloniality, where the lives of some people are considered so much less worthy than those of others that even feudal metaphors about structural and inherited hierarchies between people would not be enough to name the depth of the inequalities, but rather those of dehumanization, race, and what the Francophone Martinican author and politician Aimé Césaire called signification, which he considered the essence of colonialism in his discourse on colonialism from 1950. where some citizens, especially white citizens, are considered free subjects, while others are seen as things whose emotional and intellectual lives are more or less irrelevant. Most recently, the agreements about African migrants with Tunisia, made by the EU, initiated by the Dutch government in cooperation with Italy, after warnings for grave human rights violations from many sides, among them Amnesty International in the Netherlands, seem to be a case in point. But also discourses focused on the labor migration that we need in the near future could be part of thinking about what thingification means. More and more it is asked, therefore, in critical literature, what are the colonial and racial dimensions of these policies, and how maybe could also decolonial theory and practice help to improve or structurally transform the situation. In the first edition of Decolonising La Mer Mortelle, we centered the experience and ideas of refugees themselves to explore alternatives for today's lethal situation. It was more or less in context of Shaheen Naziri's dissertation Defense, for which he also received the Premium Erasmianum very recently, so that's maybe something to be mentioned again. So in the second meeting, we simply tried to think of a broad palette of ideas to rethink the most basic things to be rethought and done if we want to improve the situation. And it went from like business, legal ethics to a no borders plea. And it was very interesting that there were a lot of points in common to be found among these speakers. What we are going to do now in this last meeting, our panel will put the deep layers of current migration policy in the center. Deep layers, all of them linked to deep colonial legacies and infrastructures. They are also racial boundaries, and this can only be reinforced in the current, these deep layers, all of them linked to colonial legacies and infrastructures, so the more structural elements of our migration ideas and policies, are also racial boundaries. So they have always had and still have and have again racial dimensions. This can only be reinforced in the current political climate, where migration has become, like Europe's others always have been, the target of those wanting to project anti-democratic and inequality-enhancing tendencies in our societies and the ecological disaster on migration and others, closely related to Europe's history with similar projections. So we have seen this before. The complicity of Europe in creating and upholding these European boundaries, partly with drone and security materials procured from Israeli security companies, selling them as battle-tested on Palestinians, as the Australian journalist Anthony Lewenstein and many others have documented, may also bring to us the nodal points of how European migration policies are deeply linked to European legacies of colonialism, which are playing out in Israel and Palestine today. We will discuss colonial legacies and the constructions of racialized borders, and ask how the period of decolonization and colonial continuities have contributed to the regulation of migration, and how they have formed part of the conceptualization of Europeanness and of what are European countries. Rebecca Franco is the first going to talk about that. Furthermore, we will address how infrastructures of displacement and immobility are also infrastructural violence, in Huub Dijsselbloem's words. I need to mention that part of the setup for this session, and even the idea for the whole series, was inspired by the publication of Huub Dijsselbloem's book, Borders as Infrastructure, The Technopolitics of Border Control. This book was published at the MIT Press in 2021, if I'm not mistaken, and it was during the COVID time, so there was not so much time for like public presentations and so on. And this is one of the opportunities to give the book the honor it deserves. I would like to read a very brief clip from a review from Sheila Lalwani, so that you can already have a sort of idea what it's going to be about. Dijsselbloem appears comfortable and even welcoming of disparity and complexity. Case in point. In Borders as Infrastructure, he argues that borders and border control are best situated as moving phenomena that impact our understanding of territory, authority, surveillance, sovereignty, and jurisdiction. So it's about the link of these infrastructures and how we think of the concepts and like their interaction, but it's not the infrastructures that are produced by our concepts, but it's rather the opposite way around. So I'm really looking forward very much. And the leading question, of course, for this session will be, while being aware of these deep structures and hard legacies of colonialities, where are entry points for change and differences? And lastly, towards such an alternative imaginary, we will address the question, what no borders sound like, which will be given by Neske Barwald. It's a beautiful program. All the speakers will speak about 10 to 15 minutes. After that, we will have a round table with a short reaction of them on each other, but I will keep that a little bit short because otherwise, as academics, we keep talking all the time. And we have only 1.5 hours, and I want there to be time for the public as well. So we will not react on each other for a really long time. So, yeah. Please, I think the order was Rebecca, Huub, Neske, is that right? All right.
Hi, everyone. Okay. Hi, I'm Rebecca. I'm going to talk about history. Oops, thank you. About migration, colonial continuity, and I'm also going to make the link with Palestinian solidarity. So I might speak a little bit less about the construction of Europeanness and a little bit more about thinking through Palestinian solidarity to think about migration and colonialism together. So tonight we talk about Decolonising La Mer Mortelle, which I understand as a deadly, impossible and fraught passage from not only outside Europe to inside Europe, but also from colony to metropole and from colonial subject to citizen. So I want to think about this by historicizing immigration, by placing it within this longer histories of European colonialism. And through this, I will connect it also to the solidarity movement with Palestine as an anti-colonial immigrant struggle. So in current politics, and I think even more, in this present moment, there's a notion that migrations and that migrants are a form of invasion, of foreigners who should have been colonial subjects turned into foreigners and are now invading Europe as a threat. Or perhaps a more benign manifestation would be that European countries are hospitable towards unexpected guests or strangers when European nations extend them access. But looking specifically at the case of France, which I will do, I want to talk about how colonial subjects have been turned into migrants, into immigrants, and how these immigrants themselves understood their plight during the post-independence period as a colonial one. And this process, I hope to show, also shows kind of like a continuity and a transformation of the colonial status into the immigrant status. And I think France is an important case because it really shows these intimate connections between colonial empire and also post-colonial immigration. And I think Algeria is even more interesting, Algerian colonization and Algerian immigration, because it shows these connections even better. And it's good because I also did my PhD on it, so it's helpful for this talk. And so here you see France, and then the Mediterranean Sea upside down, and there's Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. So that's the image you're seeing. So it's turned upside down. So for a long time, many people who are today considered foreigners in France, so Algerians, but also, of course, Senegalese, Tunisian, Moroccans, they were part of the French Empire. They were French nationals, albeit unequal within the colonial order. And it was only after political decolonization, when France increasingly saw itself as a European nation state rather than an imperial entity, that this inequality also became consolidated within immigration policies and also borders. And I want to sketch out this process a little bit about what happened during the period of colonization and decolonization. I might go a bit fast and throw a lot of information at you, so brace yourself. So up until Algerian independence in 1962, Algeria was considered to be part of France. So it was not only, not necessarily a colony, but it was really considered to be a department of the French metropole. It was considered part of France. But that did not mean that the nationals there within this land had equal rights. Muslims from Algeria were French nationals, yes, but they were not full French citizens. There was an intricate system of laws, of decrees, of codes that instated a legal system of racialized difference. And so they were regulated differently under a different system of law. But really the bottom line that I want to focus on here is that these so-called Français musulmans d'Algérie, French Muslims of Algeria, as they were called, did not have citizenship, but were considered French. And under these laws, and especially after the Second World War, Algerians could more or less freely move into the French metropole, to European France. When I talk about French metropole, I mean European France. So on paper, they kind of had the full rights to migrate. But once they arrived in a metropole, the colonial hierarchies and the ways of governing also traveled with these French Muslims of Algeria to French proper to regulate these colonial nationals in France. And just by way of an example, the Ministry of Algerian Affairs opened a branch in France in the 1950s to promote the colonial civilizing mission of Algerians in metropolitan France. So they really introduced specialized services, and these specialized services treated colonial nationals not like other French citizens, far from it. They were much more treated like the colonial subjects within the French metropole. And so these colonial hierarchies that you saw within Algeria, and also the colonial condition of Algerians in Algeria were present and part of the French metropole, because it was the lived reality of colonial nationals in the metropole. So, for example, there was a special police, there was special housing, there was special social assistance, and all of that was aimed at controlling and managing this population. And this was quite the same, albeit different, similar but different as in Algeria. And it was after independence of Algeria, which followed a quite violent, a really quite violent struggle for independence and state violence targeting Algerians, France had to renegotiate its relationship with its former colonial nationals. And this was really quite something, and also demanded a change in the way that France looked at these people. So colonial nationals became nationals of newly independent states. And in a way, quite suddenly, people that had always been French became Algerians and therefore also foreigners in France. So where before independence, the French government really wanted to control and manage the colonial population through this colonial governance, after independence, we see that the French government increasingly and incrementally also wanted to restrict this population and their entry that had now, for most part, become foreigners. And here you see an old identity card, and you see Français musulman in the red square with nationality. So in the wake of Algerian independence, there were some special rules and regimes for Algerians to migrate to France and to opt for French nationality. But really incrementally, the French government, they revoked these special regimes of movement for these nationals. And that started in the independence agreements in 1962. Then again in 1968, where there were just a little less migration possibilities for Algerians. Again, 1972, 1974, 1977, 1980, 1981. So incrementally, the French government instated laws in an attempt to stop immigration, to stop labor migration, to stop family reunification, and especially from the former colonies on the African continent, North Africa, Senegal, Mali. So what we see here is that they started to instate a more restrictive border patrols and immigration police controls. So there were racist stop and frisks everywhere, deportation was increasing. So really in that moment they started developing the anti-immigration regime that we all have become so familiar with. So what we see in this period of the 1960s and the 1970s is a gradual rupture with the colonial relationship with Algeria and also other former colonies. And it manifests into these restrictive immigration control through which the colonial racial boundaries that were constructed during the colonial period became increasingly territorial as they consolidated within immigration control. Now, these nationals turned foreigners, they still had to deal with repressive, racist institution and police, just like they did before decolonization. But then now they also had to deal with restrictive immigration control. And it is within this period that migrants from Algeria and North Africa became politicized about the poor and the repressive conditions that they endured within France, as they had to contend with their lack of rights, the crackdown on immigration, and a huge surge in racist attacks as well in the 70s. So what we saw in this period is that migrant activists saw their condition as directly linked to colonialism and racism. The crackdown on immigration placed them back into a colonial situation, vulnerable to erratic and widespread police and state violence. So if we place migration within the continuity of colonialism and place it within the history of colonialism, it also comes as no surprise that migrants in the early post-colonial period saw their fight as an anti-colonial one. It was not an migrants' rights fight was an anti-colonial fight in their minds. Having lived through colonialism, having fought for independence of their country, most of them, living in the former colonial core, post-colonial migrants saw their marginalized condition as migrant as a colonial condition. And it therefore also comes as no surprise that solidarity with Palestine was for the migrants' rights movement a given. There's associate professor Olivia C. Harrison. She wrote a book, and that book demonstrates really beautifully how post-colonial migrants understood Palestine as a product of colonial history. Their condition in France, they also saw that as a product of colonial history. So they had to fight for it together because migrants saw it as connected through the history of colonialism. So for these North African migrants, they were workers and students mostly, these struggles were intimately connected. And they mobilized in support of the Palestinian movement, mobilized against racist attacks, and mobilized against the increasingly strict and tightening immigration regime that I just laid out. So for these people, the struggles were connected, they were the same, they were all anti-colonial and could not be seen separately from each other. And it's also interesting because the first movement of the North African workers in France was established in 1962, and it was actually born out of the movement that organized for Palestine that started in 1970, which is called the Comité de soutien de la Révolution palestinienne. And here you see the logo of the migrant. The translation would be the movement for Arab workers. This is their logo. So you see it's in the image of Palestine, and there you also see like against racism with the Palestinian population. So I want to here quote also a PhD researcher from 1978, so who in this moment also researched what was happening. And this person is called Matouk, and he stated, "The immigrant, in a sense, is the Palestinian of France." So I want to stress through this connection in the 1970s that for many people, and migrants and non-white people in particular, then and now, solidarity with Palestine is a natural extension of the anti-racist struggle, of the migrant struggle, of the anti-colonial struggle, here in the hearts of the former empire. And it also brings me to touch a little bit on the present moment, because the suppression of the solidarity encampments here at the university can also be seen as part of this longer history that is invested in a status quo. The suppression is invested in status quo. And so, in past as in present, the silencing of the solidarity with Palestine is not only a direct continuation of these colonial and post-colonial histories and a form of silencing of anti-colonial struggle, but it's also silencing of the migrant struggle and the anti-racist struggle. And I'm aware of the irony of doing a sort of talk about decolonization in this present moment, albeit with amazing colleagues and organizers here for the UvA in this space that's attached to the UvA, and that irony is not lost on me. Because we are in a long, stoppable, but also seemingly unending period in which we see Palestinians forced into mobility to leave their houses, their cities, and their lands, to hide from bombs, and forced into immobility in tents with nowhere to go. Tents and camps that are never safe from the bombs. Thank you.
You weren't done yet?
No, this was just a little extra.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to present here, and thank you, Jeske and Yolanda, for organizing this series. I think it's really special how you always manage to create a forum for colleagues and people interested in this to discuss these issues. So that's much, much appreciated. What I would like to do in the time that's given to me is talk with you about infrastructures. So what I'm going to do is present you some concepts that all relate to infrastructures. And the main throughout argument is that borders can be considered as an infrastructure themselves. And the move I'm trying to make here is that by saying that, I mean that borders are usually seen as something that intervenes in an infrastructure because they stop movement or they recirculate movement or they direct people to other locations in an infrastructure. But what I will try to do is to open up the concept of a border and try to describe it as an infrastructure itself, something that's organizes movement and is movable itself, not only in a material way, but also in a conceptual way. And the reason, the background of this line of reasoning is that I think that in Europe, especially since the mid-1980s and the signing of the Schengen agreements, you can roughly see the development of three different metaphors. The first metaphor that was applied to Europe's borders and the invention of external borders was the notion of a fortress, originally a Second World War metaphor that was now applied to the European Union. Later on, when it became clear that all kinds of data technologies, I will discuss them later, such as the Schengen Information System, the Visa Information System, and Eurodac, it became increasingly clear that it's not so much a fortress as well, perhaps surrounded by walls. These walls are still here, that we're moving from a fortress to something else, which is usually referred to as surveillance, doesn't mean that the fortress has entirely disappeared. On the contrary. But the defining metaphor became the notion of surveillance that was used to describe the control that was exercised over people outside and inside Europe's outer limits. And nowadays, we only see an increase of this metaphor with the application of all kinds of new technologies, such as drones and AI technologies. But the metaphor that I would like to introduce is the notion of infrastructure. Because with that notion, I think we get a better view on what the meaning of a border is itself and how it mobilizes all kinds of concepts. The other reason is that I think with the notion of infrastructures, you can describe both very physical, material borders like walls and fences, but also all kinds of digital borders, such as databases that define subjects, registers that make new categorizations of migrants. And the final reason is that the notion of infrastructures makes it possible to relate border structures to all kinds of other infrastructures, such as security infrastructures, knowledge infrastructures, data infrastructures. Yeah, there we go. So what I would like to do next is briefly run through a couple of notions that I introduce in the book and that are all based on this notion of an infrastructure. The first one that I would like to drop here is the notion of infrastructural experiments, because I think that the original Schengen agreements and the way they were later taken up in the European treaties can be defined as an experiment with borders, because with hindsight it is still, I think, quite amazing that something as an external border was invented that didn't exist before that time. And with that invention of the external border, all kinds of other things came into being, namely agencies such as Frontex, databases such as Schengen Information System and so on and so forth, but also new policies to make that external border movable, such as what is commonly referred to as the externalization of border control, of which the example of the pact with Tunisia is a good example. Frontex is a special example here. When it was founded in 2005, it only had a budget of 5 million euros, whereas now the most recent budget is no less than 215 million euros. And not only is the number of staff members impressive, more than 2,000 nowadays, what's even more telling is that originally Frontex was an interstate collaboration between border guards of different countries. Every border guard would still wear the flag of its own nation, whereas nowadays they wear the European symbol on their jackets. So because of that invention of such a thing as the external border, a whole new entity and a whole new agency came into being that had to take control of these borders. And this experimentation not only relates to the invention of new institutions and agencies and new things such as border, but also continues, I would say, but this is perhaps a topic for a future talk, in what we can call humanitarian experimentation, where borders now take the place not of physical borders or of lines in the sand, but of identity cards or digital money that not only makes people mobile, but also binds them to a kind of authority and to jurisdiction. Another argument that I try to develop in the book is what I call the paramorphic perspective, namely that when you want to study borders, I don't want to reduce them to their physical appearance or their material shape, but I think that if you want to understand the notions of sovereignty, authority, jurisdiction, and so on and so forth, you need to look into the architecture where these notions are manifested and expressed. And I call that a paramorphic perspective, namely that you try to discover by empirical and conceptual research the shape of borders. And one of the examples I describe in the book is Schiphol International Airport, which has, like many international airports, an amazing combination of design, detection, and detention, in such a way that it makes a seamless connection between service and security. And those kind of connections, such as between surveillance and security, I describe them with another variation on the word infrastructure, namely as infrastructural compromises, which often turn out to be very compromised compromises. Another example of an infrastructural compromise that I describe in the book is the combination between security policies and humanitarian policies. For instance, in the so-called migration crisis of 2015 and 2016, when I did my research there on the Greek Aegean Islands. What I usually use as an example for my students to explain this notion of an infrastructural compromise is the building of so-called, what are they called? An ecoduct, wildlife crossing, where reasons of biodiversity and wildlife circulation are combined with economic mobility. Finally, and Yolanda already mentioned it, I think that the notion of infrastructures allows us to think about the kind of violence that's exercised and expressed and reproduced with borders in a different way. And it also, this notion also opens up a new form of so-called infrastructural investigations. I think you're all familiar with these examples. Yolanda already referred to the famous list that mentions all the people who died, who didn't survive, either they're crossing over the Mediterranean Sea to Europe or died in one of the camps or committed suicide. All more or less related to Europe's border control. But there are different kinds of visualizations, such as these kinds of mappings and these kinds of online databases and interactive maps. And I think with the notion of infrastructural investigation, we can describe a whole series of almost detective work of artists, of academics, of and other people trying to visualize and counter-visualize what's going on at the borders of Europe. And finally, I think I need to finally stop. I think that Europe's borders can also be considered as an extreme infrastructure. And what I mean with extreme is, I mean it in the twofold meaning of extreme, meaning at the boundaries of Europe, but also extreme in the sense that it has no limits. Because I won't reduce it to a kind of internal logic, but somehow, with this open definition of the external border of the European Union, there's hardly a way to stop the violence. There's no internal stop to what the notion of a border means. So what I try to indicate with this notion of extreme infrastructures, that actually, I think that with the current notion of external boundaries and external limits of the European Union, there's hardly a way to reduce the amount of violence that comes with the definition of outer borders. Unless, and that's perhaps a challenge for today, we can invest in our infrastructural imagination and think about other ways of not bordering, but the relationship between mobility and immobility on a global scale. And I look forward to discussing that with you later on here.
Let me just set up. Hi everyone, so I'm Neske Barwald and I will talk about the question, what does no borders sound like? And I want to begin and end with what I believe is a simple orientation, which is an appreciation of life. And I think this sounds obvious to the point where it kind of feels redundant to point it out. And yet, looking at how the world is organized, it is in fact a deeply radical and radicalizing orientation. If by radical we mean, together with people like Angela Davis, grasping at the root of things. It requires deep study, an open heart, willing and able to connect with others and be moved, and a profound questioning of how the world is organized and our role in it, against the many systems in place that redistribute death downwards and wealth upwards, of which borders, I think, is one. So I think many of us know that we're in trouble. The masks are truly off, if they were ever on. As Israel's genocidal onslaught continues to destroy Palestinian life in Gaza, their battle-tested weapon systems, as Yolanda also mentioned, continue to be exported for use, not only to police and surveil the borders of Europe and the US, but to governments of all political orientations all over the world, as the work of Anthony Lowenstein has shown. And this global investment in technologies of surveillance, war, and population control converges with climate change, resource depletion, borders, and radical inequality in rather frightening ways. All sustained by a deep racism that both underlies and is produced by these structural violences, shaping who gets to live and who gets to die. With these snapshots in mind, I want to reflect on the role that sound can play in nurturing and remembering this radical yearning for another way of being, for another way of relating to one another, a yearning that I believe resides in all of us, so that we can continue to offer ourselves to the possibility of another way of being in the world, even if that world might never come. Indeed, history teaches us that the systems of domination that we fight or struggle against or with, or that we, to some extent, also adjust to, they don't just disappear, they get re-articulated. And this is sobering, because it means that there's no end to our struggles, and that our struggles might never lead to the worlds we are imagining. The lives lost really are lives lost. The limbs blown apart are blown apart. And in some ways, our struggles are archives of infinite loss. And yet, history also teaches us that nothing is set in stone, that we are building futures just as people before us have built the present, and that we are, to use an image used by philosopher Olufemi Taiwo, both inheritors of past struggles and ancestors to future struggles. And that means that what we do matters. Because whether we like it or not, these deaths change us. The garden of amputated limbs in Gaza changes us. The neglect of Sudan, Congo, Eritrea, Kashmir, and so on changes us. The bodies washing ashore along all coasts of the Mediterranean, not discriminating between borders, between countries, they change us. Because we're implicated, we're of the connections, as Edward Said put it. Underlying Europe's borders, I believe, lies what Ghassan Haj calls a fossil fuel mode of relating. A Europe that seeks to shape the world according to its needs. It's a profoundly colonial mode of being in the world, and it's sustained by a profoundly utopian or dystopian fantasy. The fantasy that you can govern who moves, settles, and lives where and how. That is, to control life itself. And the fantasy that you can, and now I'm quoting Ghassan Haj again, or I'm quoting him for the first time, that you can set yourself into the future through sheer force. Instead of negotiating your being, your existence, with the other beings that we share this planet with. Thankfully, there's a real tragedy in dominating, because life spills beyond it. Now, how does sound figure in all of this? For biographical reasons, I grew up listening intensely to Latin American resistance music produced in the 60s and 70s. Artists like Mercedes Sosa and Victor Jara and many others. Well, as a young kid, I did not fully appreciate how their music played an important part in political struggle. I sensed it through the intent, intensity, and depth of their voices, through hearing how they moved the crowds that they were singing to, and through my father's deep love for this music, moving him to change his life. I also grew up knowing that Victor Jara was murdered by the Pinochet regime after the 1973 coup, And this instilled in me a sense of what people risk as they become more and more committed to this radical orientation to life, and as they find a voice within themselves that moves others. In 2019, Ghazen writer, poet and professor Refat Al-Hariri, speaking of the arrests of fellow Palestinian poet Fadwa Tuqan, said, "Of course, we always fall into this trap of saying she was arrested for just writing poetry. We do this a lot, even us believers in literature. We say, why would Israel arrest somebody or put someone under house arrest? She only wrote a poem." So we contradict ourselves. We believe in the power of literature changing lives as a means of resistance, as a means of fighting back. And then, at the end of the day, we say, she just wrote a poem. We shouldn't be saying that. In December 2023, Refat was murdered by the Israeli state. Around 3 years ago, my friend and colleague Wiebe Ruitenberg and I started, and I must say dear friend, and I think he's listening online, so hello Wiebe. We started a podcast project called De Verbranders. Our aim was to learn about Europe's borders through conversation, music, and sound. And from the outset, we were committed to resisting the classifications imposed upon people by Europe's borders, and instead to see what emerges if you side with those who cross them. What does it mean to listen with displacement and settlement? Taking as given people's many attempts to stay, move, or settle as they see fit for whatever reasons they want, and questioning all of the systems in place that organize and govern that. Rejecting the notion that anyone can be illegal. We envisioned an audio archive not only useful for our fellow researchers, but also for people organizing against their own or others' illegalization, and anyone who simply feels drawn to it. We hope to build a space where we could learn about Europe's borders in a more open-ended, accessible, searching, emotive, and communal way than we felt we were able to do in our academic writing. We wanted to explore connections that we tend to unlearn and unsee through professionalization and specialization, while resisting some of the more restrictive and extractive cultures of the university. It was honestly freeing. This is, of course, not to say that sound, music, or podcasting, God forbid, are inherently liberatory. Clearly, they are not. Music, sound, film, and poetry are powerful when they're able to move, and when they remind us of this orientation towards life, against the systems that distribute death downwards and wealth upwards, and that normalizes these distributions. When they resist what Arundhati Roy has described as, quote, the terrifying, sweeping simplifications of fascism, as they barrel towards us, speeding down their straight, smooth highway, we greet them with our maze, end of quote. As of last week, she might now be facing terrorism charges in India. Someone whose work I really appreciate is Tom Westerns. He shows and he engages with this complicated role of sound. He shows how sound archives have played an important role both in constructing nations and borders in post-war Europe, but also in the world-making projects of anti-colonial movements that sought to unmake imperial geographies and histories. He's also part of a collective of people called the Syrian and Greek Youth Forum, who have produced what they call the Citizen Sound Archive. And I quote, "Our archives started simple. For my colleagues, it was resisting their erasure. It was proof of life. It was claiming the right to record and write, or what Edward Said calls the permission to narrate, and to extend revolutionary spaces of belonging across and against borders." I'm skipping something. For my part, I had been working on collaborative projects of recording in Athens, hearing the city through movement, a place that sings long histories of circulation, encounter, and exchange. We recorded protests, demonstrations, meetings, events, songs, concerts, rehearsals. We ran workshops to share skills of recording, editing, and mixing. We imagined a kind of media not built on crisis narratives, on colonial systems of representation that exaggerate difference and distance, that produce symbolic territories and violent materializations. We thought with archival practices of the revolution, wherein archiving becomes a way of holding on to possible futures. So let me now close this with playing a few clips from our podcast, The Verbranders, to listen to what no borders might sound like.
So freedom is not something that we should ask, because I believe everybody is born free. You have to be able to exercise it. Whether you're Ugandan and you're living in Netherlands without papers, you must exercise your freedom.
And if we were to keep our faces turned to high winds, salt spray, mountain humming green, and if, ending, the two of us had been a major lift spilled lucent through this world, and if it came to nothing, all we'd learned, and sequined glow and giant's eye half seen, was all this quiet companionship might mean, our human urge to linger fast adjourned, I'd be content with rapture by the wind. I'd leach into rich silt, the levees spent, I'd sink and cut my own path through the clay, and if, as 4 hands, warm half ice, half limbed, my dusk breath fears the final summons sent, I'd go. You know I'd love you more each day.
Lovely. Well, I grew up in the land of the sinners, home of the brave, bold and the winners. Oh, what I do to go back to winter. Oh, 5 chicken chips for our dinner. You drive about with your mates in the ringer. You're selling weed to make your pocket money bigger. The old biller always looking up my niggas. The white boys nicking price to make figures. Yeah. Growing up in East London, sunny East London, chucking eggs at the corner of the junction. At the corner of the junction.
They say that we are going to close the borders. But what they don't understand is to stand in front of you right now, right here. Tell me which borders or crescents or whatever you want to call it can actually stop me being here today. Reality is, it's not up to you. It's not up to anybody. It is my right to live. It is my right to breathe. This world is not for nobody. It is for everybody. Yeah. And if you cannot see that, if you cannot understand that point, then that's why you are lost. We are here and we will fight for our rights, for freedom, for movement. For life. Because this is about my life. It is the fact, a simple fact, that I am supposed to live. I did not choose to be in Somalia. I did not choose to be in Netherlands. But I chose to live. The thing is, we are already here. Right here in Amsterdam, in every street in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in Germany, in the whole of Europe. What does that tell you? It tells you that where there is a will, there is a way. And I have all the will to live. Yeah. Nobody is going to stop that.
If I must die, you must live. To tell my story, to sell my things, to buy a piece of cloth and some strings, make it white with a long tail, so that a child somewhere in Gaza, while looking heaven in the eye, awaiting his dad who left in a blaze, and bid no one farewell, not even to his flesh, not even to himself. Sees the kite, my kite you made, flying up above, and thinks for a moment, an angel is there, bringing back love. If I must die, let it bring hope. Let it be a tale.
Yeah, so we will take time for, as we said, a moment of reactions to each other. And then afterwards the floor will be opened for you and for question and answers. Well, you've all noticed that you're in a way in a sort of like somber mood here, but also, how do you say it? The words of life were there too. So, who can I pass the word? I would have some questions, but maybe we can also... would you like to react to...
Yeah, thanks, Jolanda. Yeah, thank you both for your contributions. It was really beautiful and also really interesting to hear what these realities look like and how they're imagined. And I was wondering, because there were, you both spoke about borders, and you started with I believe in life, right? And I think your work really shows how these infrastructures are insatiable because life doesn't matter. And thinking about the end of your, well, not the last poem, but of the person who was speaking here in Amsterdam saying, well, if you don't believe in my right to live, then you are lost. So I was just thinking, and wanted to ask the both of you to speak about what it means, this insatiability, this limitless, this limitlessness of these infrastructural borders and infrastructural violence for what it means to live in Europe and to be European. And because I think you started with this a response to it, I think. So yeah, if you could both speak to it, that was my question.
Would you like to start, or shall I? Yeah. Thank you. Yes, thank you for that. Maybe I can start with elaborating a bit on the notion of border as a limit, because I agree with that, and in my own presentation I was talking about the invention of the external borders of the EU, about the limits and the limit as a kind of a moving thing that moves in all kinds of directions. At the same time, we have to be careful, I think, to not only understand a border as a limit, because what a border does is not just stop people, it's mainly a selection mechanism. It either redirects people, because if people stop, will go into another direction. But more importantly, I think, is that it selects by making all kinds of classifications and categorizations. And that's, we will talk about that later, is also, I think, an important link to racism. What borders do is make selections. So the irony is also that, for instance, there's, as some migration scholars have pointed out, there's no direct relation, not always, between, let's say, right-wing governments and more restrictive migration policies. What they do is they allow for a different kind of migrations. Even Hungary these days is, because of the aging population, allowing more labor migrants. So maybe we, in that sense, we perhaps should think about the unequal distribution of limits to life projects of people, instead of a kind of an absolute category that's imposed on everybody here.
Yeah, thank you for that kind of synthesizing question. And it's interesting because the limitlessness that you picked up on, I also picked up on it when you were speaking, but I interpreted it differently. And maybe let me know if my interpretation is wrong. But I thought what you were alluding to is this idea that borders are limitless in a sense that they are self-strengthening. And with that I mean that they produce their own objects of governance. So borders, through processes of legal categorization, they produce the very thing, illegalized people, that they then fight. And there's something endless and limitless in that. And I think this is what you were referring to, alluding to in the end. And I think there's a really, really long history to that also links up with your presentation. Because domination, systems of domination, never fully manage to dominate. And then these systems of domination become super paranoid about all of these ways in which people don't abide to these attempts to dominate. And there's a long history of, within slavery, like a deep fear and a kind of paranoia about slave revolts, paranoia rooted in reality, but people who dominate become paranoid about their inability to fully dominate. And it will always be incomplete. So I think there is, and borders are one kind of manifestation of that, but as the episode we recorded with Ghassan Haj, as Ghassan Haj points out, there's also a similar dynamic at play in Israel right now, where you, kind of what's underlying this is this idea that you can, again, what I mentioned earlier, but set yourself into the future through sheer force. Yeah. So, and I think life, and that's why for me life is so generative. I don't like that word because it sounds so academic-y. But it is generative. But life just spills beyond these attempts to dominate. It's an impossible project. And and that I said thankfully in my talk, but there's also something really scary about that, because I think fascism is very much fed by this paranoia and by this attempt to then dominate to the extreme this undominatable world. Maybe I'll end there.
Can I also ask them a question, or is there no time for that?
Yes, there is.
Later on is
like
also
I was planning, like we do 10 minutes, like a quarter of an hour reactions to each other. So there's time enough, and then we have a quarter of an hour for a Q&A. So go ahead.
Yeah, because thank you. In Rebecca's and Neske's presentation, in different forms, you also related to the notion of immobility. People that become foreigners and migrants all of a sudden after 1962, or the "we are here because you were there" kind of notion in one of the sound clouds you presented. So could you elaborate a bit more on the notion of immobility of people? Also interesting, perhaps because I think 20 years ago, when the mobility turn in the social sciences came up, it was really welcomed as a new perspective and a way to circumvent methodological nationalism by focusing on mobility. You could also avoid speaking about migration and avoid the state-centric perspective. Yet now it turns out that sometimes mobility can also be a bias. If you only focus on mobility, then it also becomes a kind of a force that you expect people to move. Whereas we sometimes have a lot of explanations of why people move, but hardly sometimes of why people do not move, why people want to stay, as if that's a kind of a leftover category. So maybe you want to talk us through that a little bit.
You go first.
Yeah, thank you. So the way that I think about your question would be that for me, also in my research and what comes up is not necessarily the physical immobility, although it can be a physical immobility, but the immobility of not being allowed to be let in, not like that, not you, not now, there but not here. And that's what I saw also in my research, is that even though there were colonial migrants who could come to France, they couldn't live in this neighborhood, they couldn't do this, they weren't allowed to work there. And so basically the immobilization through the creation of racial boundaries by relegating certain people to the margins of society. So for me, the immobility is also the impossibility to be let in.
Yeah, I think for me, my starting point, like yours, I think, has always been to take as my object of study borders and not people labeled as migrants by borders. And I think that already gets you a long way away from the mobility bias that you are mentioning. I can explain that a bit in that human movement is only categorized as migration if you cross an international border, and only some people who cross these borders are labeled socially or legally as migrants. So it's actually borders that produce this whole idea of some mobilities, kind of naturalize some people's mobilities while naturalizing that of others. And I think we need to view borders. I think we need to look at borders and how movement and settlement is governed in many ways, and how that relates to all kinds of other processes and things happening in the world, right? And it's almost like I think the mobility bias is real, but it's only real in a small field of academic research that has looked at this for so long that they almost can't see anymore the world that it's taking place in. What I wanted to end with is actually an appreciation of where you ended your presentation, which was by pointing out that Palestinians are both forced into mobility and forced into immobility in a variety of ways. And I think if you start out by actually engaging with people's lives, you find a lot of that. Then the mobility bias is gone if you put off your scholastic glasses. I have a number of questions, if I may. So I have a question for you, Rebecca, because I know that you, in your work, you also focused on how this policing of racial boundaries, how that is put into practice in the intimate sphere and in kind of through regulating sexualities. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I'll keep it just very brief. I think what's interesting in this period before the restriction of immigration is that there's really a construction of interior boundaries, right? And I wanted to show very briefly how throughout the 1970s they became territorial as well through immigration regimes, but in the 1950s, 1960s, it was really about constructing these interior racial boundaries by constructing who was the right type of person, by constructing the domestic sphere in a specific way as being civilized or non-civilized, by creating racial boundaries between people within a closer physical space, for example, within the city. That's why I mentioned, like, you're allowed to live in this neighborhood but not in that neighborhood, because what if you meet and something will happen? So it was constructing these interior racial boundaries that were not necessarily legal, but was about the way that you could make a life, make a family, live a full life as a person.
And I also have a question for you, but it's unrelated. But hence my inability to synthesize as beautifully as you both did. But you mentioned the invention of the external border, which I thought was really, really like interesting. Can you talk a little bit more about this process of invention? Like how did that happen? How was the external border invented, and how was it contested? Maybe also at the time.
Yeah, the European Union was a bit smaller in 1995 when the Schengen Agreement was arrived at. And I think the initial reason to abandon internal borders were all kinds of traffic jams in the countries, all kinds of customs regulations, different fiscal systems, different labor agreements. So it was very in a way, the markets-oriented logic of the European Union that led to the abolishment of the internal borders. So that was the main goal. So only because they were giving up the internal borders, they had to define an external border. That was the only thing left, and that was the new invention. And what they didn't take into account was, of course, that the European Union would broaden and that it would have all kinds of different borders still. Land borders, sea borders, air borders. What became overall globally the most defining regime is, of course, the visa regime. And that continues the colonial legacies of countries, and it really defines who can take an airplane to Europe and who needs to cross a land or a sea border. So in order to take account of that and to compensate for the geographical location of countries like Italy and Greece, all kinds of new agreements had to be made, such as the infamous Dublin agreements, which you're probably, everybody's aware about that right now. So I think that's what started as a market-oriented logic led to a whole series of agreements that had to fill in to regulate this unknown new entity of the external border. This is the short version.
Well, it's exactly 9:15, so we're on schedule. We would have things to discuss, but most probably there are also people among you who would like to say something. It doesn't necessarily have to be a question, but don't make it too long. But who can we pass the word? Okay, thanks. It's always nice, you think, oh gosh, now nobody has a question, and then someone turns up, suddenly 3 people.
Okay. I thought it was really interesting what you said in the end about how Schengen came across more from this like liberal free market ideology, but then in the end really played into enabling a lot of like extreme right and like anti-migration colonial ideas. And I feel like that's very similar to what is happening in the Netherlands right now in like the new cabinet, how it's actually like these central liberal parties that really facilitate the extreme right more than anything else, it seems like. That was it. It's not really a question. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, that's important.
We're collecting questions.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Do you want to react?
No, very
That's also possible, of course.
Okay.
Yeah, go.
Now, in this current political constellation, also interesting to take into account that I think from the 1970s, the migration policies in the Netherlands were not so much driven by left-wing parties, but started with right-wing parties that wanted to have labor forces, cheap labor forces on the markets. So when all these young men from Turkey and Morocco came in, later on, the Christian Democrats said, well, but those young men need their families. So that's when family reunification came in. So the origins of the welfare state migration from the 1970s and the rise of the so-called gastarbeiders were actually an agreement between the right wing and the Christian democratic parties in the Netherlands. So who knows what's going to happen next?
Yes, thank you so much for the really interesting lecture. Dr. Jansen, you started today's talk by describing the problem of sort of seeing migrants as objects versus subjects, and then you, Dr. Bauweld, ended with, well, part of the audio clip was a person saying, I don't need anyone to give me my freedom, I already have it. And there's sort of one dimension across all the different contributions today that I might be slightly missing, which is sort of the element of agency. When we talk about mobility, there's lots of talk about sort of forced mobility, or Dr. Frank also talked about forced immobility, forced mobility. And there is this sort of tendency in political discourse, sort of across mainstream politics really, that migrants should only really deserve our sympathy if they are somehow forced to migrate to the metropole, right, because of war, conflict, climate change, etc. And that somehow those migrants who want to move because of free will are not deserving of the same level of sympathy and sort of the same state response. So just curious sort of how this dimension of, I don't want to get into the debate about free will, but at least agency, how that fits into this thinking around mobilities and immobilities.
Yeah, I don't know about free will. I won't burn my fingers on that. But so I think Yolanda was quoting Césaire and his work on, or his discourse on colonialism, in which he describes thingification as one of the, I guess, core principles underlying this thing that he's trying to think through. And he also links it to what he says, in a colonial relationship, you are never in contact. That's not he contrasts it to contact, to real human contact. And he also links it to this idea that this dehumanization and this thingification is not only happening to the thing you're thingificating, but also to the person who is thingifying. They themselves become dehumanized through this. And your question relating to agency, I think, there is a tension. On the one hand, you have this thingification that kind of limits people's freedom, that structures people's freedom, and there's people who just live beyond it. It's a bit like Karl Marx said, but we make life, he says it differently, but not under the conditions of our choosing, right? And I think, so to link it back also to where you went with, I'm going to call it the politics of innocence, but the idea that only people who behave in a certain way or who fled for the worst reasons are allowed to be a full person, but even that space is confined, right? The space of a refugee is very confined also, but are allowed to break a little bit beyond this thingification. I think we really need to resist that politics of innocence and stand next to the least sympathetic person on the deportation flight, or stand next to the person who moved for the most arbitrary reasons. Because the thing I think we need to address is how borders are machines of discrimination. They discriminate and they create different bodies of law for different people. But I don't know if I addressed your question. Maybe someone else can pick it up further. With agents.
Perfectly.
Yeah.
I'll keep it brief. Yeah, thanks. Interesting question. Maybe I would be a bit more hesitant about this notion of will and agency, because I don't want to imply that you were doing that, but it runs the risk of situating the agency of a migrant into a kind of a push-pull model, where there are clear reasons for migration, whereas usually migration is a very mediated process. If the agents have a will, then it's, according to some theories, a combination of their mobility aspirations on the one hand and their economic, social, cultural capabilities. So a decision to migrate is hard to position in a specific subject, also because there is hardly not an entirely clear causal relationship between changing circumstances, possibilities to migrate. It's a very complicated process. So I would be a bit hesitant to put agency and the will central in that complex situation where people start moving or have to move or combine different mobilities with immobilities in their life.
I suppose there's this thing where movement has always existed, but the borders haven't. So in the moment that you start with a border, you have to start making exceptions for the conditions to come in. So without thinking about agency or free will, movement historically has always happened, and I think that's the I think we need to question perhaps the agency of why we want borders in the first place, right? So maybe that's where the discussion also lies. Yeah.
It was just beyond the borders. So thanks a lot for these very interesting presentations. So while listening to Rebecca's talk and Huub's talk, I was actually reminded of Achille Mbembe's criticism of the notion of democracy as such, which has been emerged in the Western tradition from the ancients up to now. So just to put it briefly, according to Mbembe, Western democracies cannot exist, or they are actually premised on the notion of colony, so on the colonized subject. So while thinking about the idea of infrastructure, in your case, just your historical analysis of how these colonized subjects actually emerge and re-emerge in different spatio-temporal era, I was thinking, first of all, for Huub, whether you could actually elaborate on perhaps the economic aspects of the notion of infrastructure that you are just entertaining in your beautiful book, and how that relates to the notion of border, and whether we can understand. So the idea is whether present-day democracies can actually exist without these colonies, without these bordered subjects. And just getting back to Rebecca, and how does that relate to the Israeli democracy in the Middle East, which is perhaps premised on this idea of colony, which is the Palestinian thingified objects. So these are just some thoughts. Maybe you could just elaborate on that. Thank you.
Well, thanks again for a great question, and I think the two of you need to think about a new series here at the Spy 25. Yeah, great question, but let me try to reflect on that. I think there's two things that are important here. On the one hand, there's a clear relationship between European states, colonies, and traditions of bordering. Many techniques were first implied in the colonies, like fingerprinting, or making registers, or making classifications of all kinds of people, and only later used at the borders in Europe. There's still all kinds of colonial and racist traditions very present at processes of bordering. On the other hand, some historians have pointed out that we have to be careful about not reproducing a Eurocentric view if we keep thinking about in terms of Europe and colonies. Because historically, for instance, the one thing is that it's a myth that Westphalia was born in Europe, so to say, or that the combination between sovereignty, borders, and territory of states is uniquely European. You see combinations of authority and states and citizenship and borders and all kinds of variations worldwide in many different periods of history. So it's not just a European invention that was spread all over the world. And other, like our colleague at the University of Amsterdam, Darshan Vigneswaran, in a beautiful article, Europe Has Never Been Modern, there's some beautiful research and archives pointing out that also the relationship between colonies or non-European countries and migration already for centuries has been very mixed. That it came with all kinds, that it was not just people coming to Europe, but it had to do with all kinds of agreements between states, between emperors, between kings, between rulers, trying to regulate labor forces, mobility of rich people, sending young people to school, returning money to the family, staying there. So I think that's, on the one hand, I fully agree that we have to, and we haven't, there's still so much work to do in studying these colonial origins of borders. Yet on the other hand, it's also interesting to see the interaction that has been going on for ages in defining streams of migration between various very different countries. I haven't even answered your economic aspects.
Thank you. I feel like it's a difficult question because it's also my expertise does not lie on Palestine and Israel, but I do want to speak to your question because I think there's an importance to how I understand it and also how I wanted to present it in my presentation. Is I'm going to relate it back to Europe. Actually, is how we can understand what has been happening in these last 75 years in Israel as also a part of like the construction of European democracy and European history by being implicated in the construction of the State of Israel as a way of externalizing, let's say, the Jewish question. So, you know, and maybe I'm going a little bit beyond your question here, but I think in a way it really pains me to see how the way that I see it, that Jewish people have been are now in a way like let, I say like to the wolves in a way, because to me what is happening in Israel is actually also a distinctly European problem as a response to the Holocaust and allowing and contributing to the movement of Zionism that of course already existed. So to me, it's a continuation of European colonialism mixed with the age-old history of European deadly anti-Semitism, which is now implicating and has been implicating Palestinians for 75 years. So yes, it's about Israeli democracy, but I also think it's about like Dutch democracy, French democracy, British democracy, and how we have, thrown Jewish people and Palestinian both to the wolves, and unfortunately Palestinians have been really bearing the brunt of it after the Holocaust. Yeah.
Thanks for that very courageous, good, and I very much support what you were saying there. Maybe that's also an opportunity to end this meeting with announcing another one, because tomorrow, if you're interested, it's actually, well, it's especially for people working in the humanities, but if we're not a big group, so just to know, there's going to be a lecture by Santiago Slobodski, and he's a very interesting scholar, and he's going to talk about the colonial fabrication of eternal enmity. So that's very, I think, immediately connected to what you were saying about the history of what we're going through, and also the European responsibility to think that through and to take the responsibility much more strongly than we have done so far. Yeah, and that's maybe also a good way to end this evening. Thank you very much. And it's also the end of this series, but as you said, maybe there should be other opportunities. We had to plan to invite also other speakers who were delayed, doing other things, so there are opportunities enough. I'm thinking of Leila Bashir. And but we'll come back with another plan. And thank you very much for your contributions. Thanks also Spa 25 very much.